Welcome to the Poetry Room at City Lights, and for those of you online, welcome to you as well. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush people, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. So tonight, City Lights is very delighted to be celebrating together with Ecco Books, the publication of Poet in the New World, Poems 1946 through 1953. This is by Czeslaw Milosz. It's, of course, translated by Robert Haas and David Frick. It has a foreword by Robert Haas. And this wonderful new collection from Nobel laureate Czeslaw Milosz is really combining like this span of time when he was in Washington, D.C., and kind of like connecting to his years in Europe. It includes a lot of previously untranslated poems written during that time. Milosz is, of course, one of the most revered poets of the 20th century, and Poet in the New World gathers poems that really capture him at his existential and very stylistic best. His insights on the human condition while grappling with the extraordinary violence that he had witnessed during World War II in Warsaw and in the post-war years really make this an essential addition to the Milosz canon. And it's translated and really has been beautifully rendered by Robert Haas and David Frick. So we're very deeply honored to have with us again tonight Robert Haas, who is no stranger to City Lights, and his knowledge of Milosz, of course, is exemplary. He's going to be reading excerpts from this wonderful collection. Mr. Haas, of course, is, as I mentioned, no stranger to City Lights. He's a Pulitzer Prize winner, National Book Award winner. He served as Poet Laureate of the United States from 1995 through 1997. He's also been Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. He's produced numerous collections of poetry and collected essays, as well as translations. His own works include such titles as The Apple Trees at Alima and Time and Materials, amongst many others. He does make his home here in the Bay Area with his wife, the poet Brenda Hillman, and teaches at the University of California at Berkeley. So we will be having a Q&A towards the end of the reading and discussion. And for those of you online, we have posted links with which you may purchase the books. And this is such a wonderful moment because, you know, it's been a long time since we've done anything for Milosz, and I think it's really an interesting moment to be able to kind of once again reintroduce his work to yet a younger generation of people. So please join us now in giving a warm welcome to Robert Haas.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. Hi, you guys. So I should jump right in because there are stories to tell about this book, and then you will want to hear some of the poems. Czeslaw Milosz was born into the Polish gentry in Lithuania. I gather that being Polish gentry in Lithuania was like being English gentry in Ireland. The peasantry spoke Lithuanian. The people in the villages spoke Yiddish or Russian. And the people who had the manor houses, imagine the world of Thomas Hardy, those kind of farms, spoke Polish. And most of the amazing poets in the Polish tradition came from Lithuania rather than from Warsaw in those years. So that's his background. He was born in 1911, and he started writing poetry in his teens and 20s. He died in 2003. So he wrote poetry for 80 years. There's this immense body of work and an equal amount of prose to go with it. So in his early 30s, so he would have been 29 when the Germans took over Warsaw. So he lived through the Nazi occupation of Warsaw and the destruction of the ghetto. At the end of the war, as the German army was leaving Warsaw in advance of the arrival of the Russians. Joseph Stalin ordered the Russian army to sit tight while they let the German army destroy 2/3, maybe 80% of the city of Warsaw. Picture Gaza. And anyway, it's hard to talk about this stuff without talking about the history of bombardment. So he lived through those years. When the war, and he published 2 early books of poems, one of which is quite amazing. The poetry he wrote during the period of the occupation is among his best work. It's written in his early 20s. When the war was over, he applied for a diplomatic post and got it. And having walked away from Warsaw, in which really 80% of the buildings had been destroyed, this makes me think that there were 11 universities in Gaza. 2 million people, 11 universities, every one of them has been destroyed. So the poetry that Milosz was writing in this period was trying to figure out how to deal with a world governed by force. And that was part of the interest to me. So when he was working in Washington, imagine coming from the destruction of Warsaw to Times Square. Well, let's go to poetry. So one of the first things he wrote back from New York to Warsaw was, "Buildings this tall make no sense, and neon is a cheap gimmick." He was horrified by this place at first. For various reasons. So anyway, the story part is, so from 1945, early 1946 to 1950, he did the duties of a junior associate in the embassy, first in the consulate in New York and then in the embassy in Washington for 4 years. Meanwhile, the Soviet colonial policy was taking over Poland, and he was aware of that he had no other he had no other option but to go with this clearly autocratic government, and then after a while he couldn't do it, and it shows up in the poems in various ways. In 1950, he'd been recalled to Warsaw from New York. They took away his passport, and he worked the system as best he could. Former girlfriend married to a higher up in the new Soviet installed government in Poland, got his passport back, got assigned to Paris, and then applied for political asylum, which meant it felt to him like giving up his audience and his language, and jumped ship. Didn't know if the government was going to go after him. He went into hiding for a while in Paris, and then when it became safe, first thing he did was write a book justifying what he had done, the Captive Mind, a prose book that became, along with 1984 and Darkness at Noon, one of the classic books about how the European imagination dealt with tyranny. and a world of power. And he wrote poems during that period. He wrote 2 novels in those years and another book in times. It made enough money to bring his wife, who was still in the United States, back to Paris with him. The family was united. Tried to scratch out a living as a Polish exiled writer, publishing. His work couldn't be published in Poland. And then in 1960, was offered a job on the other side of the world at the University of California. He arrived here, and between 1960 and 1980, lived in the Berkeley Hills, writing poems about the sun going down over the Golden Gate Bridge that nobody could read. Because his poems couldn't be published. There was one small publisher that turned out to be the publisher of most of the interesting writers of that period. Cultura magazine in Paris was an outlet for him. So then in 1960, he begins to write this untethered poetry of exile and memory, which is much of this work. Wrestling with the violence, wrestling with survivor guilt, wrestling with a childhood relationship to religion that made him yearn for there to be some grounded justice in the world, not one made up. All of the philosophical movements made up, so he did that for 20 years. Then in 1980, he received the Nobel Prize and went from being an obscure, unknown professor with a funny name to having his picture on postage stamps all over Poland. It was in those years that I met him. Rob took one of the classes that Czeslaw and I taught together at the University of California during that time. It was fascinating to see him. So the one period in which, for years, we would meet on Monday mornings. He would translate a few poems, sometimes poems written in the 1930s, sometimes poems written in the 1950s, sometimes poems written the day before, one or two, and we would just go over them. So I don't know Polish. When I started on this project, I didn't think I would be doing it for 25 years, so I didn't try to learn Polish at first. Then later I got dictionary and tapes, and I can now tell if a poem is about a cloud or a river, but it takes me all day to read a newspaper, so I never really learned Polish. So I would just work with him. There would be a line. There's a poem in which the soul is identified as she, seems to be the main speaker. And it's a poem that begins roughly, the earth falls away from the place where I stand, and further on, the buds of the chestnuts shine. So maybe that would be the lines that he would propose, and I would say, well, maybe it would be better to say earth falls away from the place where I am standing. It would make him more immediate and present. He said, it says stand in the Polish. And I said, well, okay, you're the one who has to read it, but I would write stand. Anyway, so that was my part of the translation. I knew that the poems from this period, this incredible period, he'd walked away from the awful destruction in the rising of the young Poles in Poland in 1944, beginning of 45. 250,000 were killed. 80% of the buildings, 250,000 people were killed. This is quite apart from what happened to the Jews of Poland. When the war broke out, most of the officer corps of the Polish army went east to Russia to join the Russians in the fight after the Stalin-Hitler pact had broken up. Went east to join the Russian army to fight against the Germans. There were 22,000 of them in camp. A famous book by a dear friend of ours came out of it. A guy who'd been an officer in the Polish army, who also happened to be the best Polish painter of that period. When they were waiting to be assigned to Russian units to fight against the Germans, this guy amused himself by giving lectures on Proust from memory. And a friend of ours translated that book. It's quite wonderful. We recommend it. Anyway, there were 22,000 people in that camp. And again, on Stalin's order, all 22,000 of them were taken out into a place called Catton Woods, on the border between Poland and Russia, and killed in a period of 3 days. Must have really been exhausting for the soldiers to kill 22,000 people in 3 days. Anyway, that's the world you go back into if you go into these poems, or you try to figure out how not to do it. I say in my introduction to this book that the most famous thing anyone has said about those years is what Theodor Adorno said, which is, it's barbarism to try to write poetry after Auschwitz. I was thinking about that and looked up to see where Adorno was living when he said that. Pacific Palisades, which is just burned down. Anyway, Milosz is trying to figure out how to write poetry. He also had so after the war was over, or after they walked away from the war, the first thing that happened is, see, I could tell these stories and never get to the poems. When they walked away from, he and his girlfriend, soon his wife, and her mother, when their neighborhood got torched, they just got together their valuables and walked. And they were picked up by a German patrol and put into a holding tank. And Czeslaw saw some kids outside playing soccer. So he called them over and he gave them letters to give to various friends saying, we've been arrested, help. A nun from the local convent showed up, spoke to the commandant of the camp, and let them go. They walked for 2 days and then were met by thieves who took everything they had. And then they got lodging with a farmer digging potatoes. There's a little bit of a later poem of his describing that moment. Years later, beyond the turmoil, he would remember it as a moment when he had stepped out of history. And I quote these lines: I rolled a cigarette and licked the paper, then a match in the little house of my hand, and why not a tinder box and flint? The wind was blowing. I sat by the road at noon, thinking and thinking. Beside me, a pile of potatoes. By early November, they had headed south and east, reached the estate of friends in the village near Krakow, where they and other lodgers found refuge. In Krakow, a government was starting to be formed. He joined a writers' union. He applied for the unlikely job as a diplomat, and finished the book of poems written during the war years, and within a year was in London having lunch with T.S. Eliot, whose new poems he had just translated, and then was in New York. The embassy had rented him and his wife a place on the west side in the 80s, and the Polish consulate was on the east side in the 70s. So you can imagine exactly what path he walked to work every day. It takes a little while for Central Park to show up in these poems. Part of my interest in getting together with David Frick to translate them was it's too lazy to try to get out dictionaries and read them. I just wanted to know what was in them, and also something of why he wasn't keen on the poems of this period. When he was asked about it, he said, I had difficult personal circumstances. I could never figure out a way to organize these poems. I just write this book off as a loss. So, which made me, I want to see it. Let me find it here, 53. So this is summer movies in Central Park. He had an ongoing argument with a friend who's a philosopher named Julius Kronsky. There's a long chapter in one of his books about his debate with this guy whose nickname was Tiger. He was a fierce Marxist and also a fierce anti-Stalinist. And he was very interested in Milosz's public persona as a successful young poet. Complicated in a way. Imagine the situation in Washington. Czeslaw wrote a poem about a little black girl playing Chopin at a concert. Chopin being the revolutionary. When he sent the poem to the Polish magazine, he also sent it to Kronsky in Paris, and Kronsky said, "Now, writing about American racism, don't suck up to the Stalinists." It was complicated time. Anyway, I wanted to know what this poem about Central Park was like. And I have to say, I'll read the first stanza of it because David Frick, who was a scholar of Polish, and he was the one who encouraged me, talked me into working on this. So he read it to me, and I said, I don't have the faintest idea what this is about. And he said, neither do I. And I said, let's take it very slowly. In the dim light, on the trampled grasses, girls are lying still with soldiers in their arms, just after the war, until the image alters, dark glance of a shoulder, an unbuttoned blouse. Trees spring from the ancient bedrock, and the sprays of leaves fall like chords. When nature becomes a theater, the silvery machinery of the skyline shifts. This is pure description. I'm thinking of Michael. Your inventiveness, you would never settle for this. Anyway, this is about the movie, the movie projector playing on the light on all those tall buildings along Fifth Avenue. When nature becomes a theater, the silvery machinery of the skyline shifts. The summit of the abstract city quivers under murky rainbows in the humid summer air. Honeycombs of metal or stalactites divide the distance into sheer domains. I remember a field where the radiance of the burning city colored the dry wormwood and crickets played red from the glow through which an army of smoke was marching. The water rushing along the road flutters the dress of the corpse of a woman, and the city descends long days and nights into legend which won't compensate for its disasters. This memory contains a warning for those who spend their nights on soft couches. An errant fire will often burn right through the rosiest stain on bed sheets. There are, according to the Greek philosophers, the rosy stains on bed sheets. Next section. Whoever enters the human cosmos, where marvels are performed, should know that it delivers serenely on a daily basis the retributions of malignant fate. They don't hear this. As if the fresh earth had brought forth the first palm after the flood, trembling, these young couples enter the quiet grove of sex and simply give themselves to each other. And yet even here, in the middle of Manhattan, I could see how, at a warning sound, their faces would blanch in the glare of the screen, and sudden fright weaken their legs. Here, in the line of cars along Fifth Avenue, I see how the ambassador's limousine glides past the white masts on which various flags of fictitious color hang in a mild breeze. The poor envoys, their labors are great, as they, eyes asquint, compose a holy covenant with duplicitous ink, or the pact between the Athenians and the Lacedaemonians. And what sort of power was granted to us, Julius? Addresses his friend in Paris, Kronsky. And what sort of power was granted to us, Julius, when we foresaw the fate of our native realm, which was to be brought under the militarized feet of foreign powers? We had barely mourned in our secret hearts that Europe, mother of arts and sciences, with its old wisdom and bloody cobblestones, as we placed it on the scale opposite a new faith. Looking calmly at force, we know that the ones who want to rule the world will pass away. And we know that it isn't always necessary to live by the knife or the submachine gun. We know that the ingenuity of our weapons is disastrous, that the whirlwind shreds banners, and that the heirs of the glory of the Greek name, but glory is our heritage from Greece, will last as long as humankind lasts. And that this age of darkness will pass the way winters pass, when the strong sap rises under brittle bark. The smiles of the sophists, as in papal Rome, will knock the pen from the hands of the inquisitors. Just as once upon a time, books were brought from Constantinople to our northern lands, the voices of wise men in the wild lands will become a source of creative power again. It's this honor, Julius, that is granted us, to resurrect new forms forged of gold, in spite of the leisurely pace of change, to mix valiant drinks for the future. Greet the Parisian streets for me, please. Kronsky's in Paris, and the fountain in the Luxembourg Gardens. Likewise the Seine, in which to this day I can see the cathedral's arches and the sleeping boats. I don't know whether Montaigne's monument still stands, whose white marble lips a girl, as a joke, had painted blush red and run off, lowering her head in laughter. There are, according to the Greek philosophers, 7 stages to the journey. We may not be familiar with them all, so let this wandering road through ashes of war be our chosen path, and receive, Julius, as a gift, an afternoon's description of this excessively proud land, meaning America, excessively proud land, through the ashes of, though the ashes of war is our, and receive as a gift an afternoon's description of this excessively proud land, and with it my hope that books will preserve this little drawing of Central Park. So this is him beginning to come to terms with the, when he got to Krakow, his best buddy was there, a novelist named Jerzy Andrzejewski, who wrote Ashes and Diamonds and Canal, the great movies. They went back to look at Krakow to see what was left of it. And this is a poem of that occasion, written a couple of years before the Central Park poem, and it's called In Warsaw. What are you doing here, poet, on the ruins of St. John's Cathedral, this sunny day in spring? What are you thinking here, where the wind blowing from the Vistula scatters the red dust of the rubble? You swore never to be a ritual mourner. You swore never to touch the deep wounds of your nation, so you would not make them holy with the accursed holiness that pursues descendants for many generations. But the lament of Antigone, searching for her brother, is indeed beyond the power of endurance, and the heart is a stone in which is enclosed like an insect the dark love of a most unhappy land. I did not want to love so. That was not my design. I did not want to pity so. That was not my design. My pen is lighter than a hummingbird's feather. The burden is too much for it to bear. How can I live in this country where the foot knocks against the unburied bones of my kin? I hear voices, see smiles. I can't write anything. 5 hands seize my pen and order me to write the story of their lives and deaths. Was I born to become a ritual mourner? I want to sing of festivities, the greenwood into which Shakespeare often took me. Leave to poets a moment of happiness, otherwise your world will perish. It's madness to live without joy, and to repeat to the dead, whose part was to be gladness of action in thought and in the flesh, singing, feasts, only the 2 salvaged words, truth, justice. So that was his state of mind in early 1943.
Bob, could you read that one again?
Read
That same one again?
the whole thing.
The one you just read, or part of it you just read.
Yeah,
Warsaw.
sure. What were you doing here, poet, on the ruins of St. John Cathedral in this sunny day in spring? So working on this for years, I began to get a little feel for the prosody of Polish. Take a minute to do this. So when I started, Czeslaw was taught in the Polish Slavic language department. I was in the English department. One of my best friends from grammar school studied with him at Berkeley. I had read The Captive Mind in the 1950s. Everybody read The Captive Mind. I knew who he was. And I heard that a book of his was floating around and was not available for translation. No one wanted to publish it. So, and I had just had a book of mine taken by Echo Press, and I wrote to Daniel Halpern there and said, this guy's supposed to be great. And Dan read the book, which he translated with Lillian Valley, wonderful translation by his assistant. So Dan took the book to be published, came out to meet Czeslaw, introduced me to Czeslaw. Czeslaw said, maybe you would do me a favor. There's an international poetry festival in 2 weeks, and I'm awkward reading my own poems in English. Would you read the English translation and I'll read the Polish? And I said I'd be honored. And the next version was, oh my God, he's going to come over to my house while we look over the poems. What kind of beer should I get him? But skipping over that part, we got to San Francisco, and one of the other people in the gathering was Isaac Bashevis Singer, another Nobel laureate and from Poland, and the Polish world and the Jewish world were so far apart in those years that they had been unaware of each other. And when Czeslaw moved to New York, one of the first things he saw in the window of a bookshop was Singer's novels, and he bought one of the novels. And now in Fort Mason, he's meeting Singer for the first time, and they fall on each other talking in Polish. And then Ferlinghetti comes up and says, "You guys talk to me in English." And they were, and anyway, and I thought, this is really cool to be here in this place. So that was, I think, when Lawrence and Czeslaw met. "What are you doing here, poet, on the ruins of St. John's Cathedral in this sunny day in spring? What are you thinking here?" Oh, I was starting to say, so the poetry that he wrote from the time I was working with him, and he really absorbed a lot of English and American poetry, and he was writing poems in free verse. So it's relatively easy to do a good job translating free verse. It's way tougher to do metrical poetry. Almost all of these poems are metrical, and almost all of them rhymed. And I just passed on it. "What are you doing here, poet, on the ruins of St. John's Cathedral in this sunny day in spring?" If spring rhymes with ruin, it changes the meaning. "What are you thinking here, where the wind blowing from the Vistula scatters the red dust of the rubble? You swore never to be a ritual mourner. You swore never to touch the deep wounds of your nation, so you would not make them holy with the accursed holiness that pursues descendants for many centuries. But the lament of Antigone searching for her brother is indeed beyond the power of endurance, and the heart is a stone in which is enclosed like an insect the dark love of a most unhappy land. I did not want to love so. That was not my design. I did not want to pity so. That was not my design. My pen is lighter than a hummingbird's feather. The burden is too much for it to bear. How can I live in this country where my foot knocks against the unburied bones of my kin? I hear voices, see smiles. I can't write anything. 5 hands seize my pen and order me to write the story of their lives and deaths. Was I born to become a ritual mourner? I want to sing of festivities, the greenwood into which Shakespeare often took me. Leave to poets a moment of happiness, otherwise your world will perish. It's madness to live without joy, and to repeat to the dead, whose part was to be gladness of action in thought and in the flesh, singing feasts, only the 2 salvaged words, truth, justice. What did you want to hear on the second part?
All of it again.
Yeah.
To be able to hear the second
Yeah.
one. Thanks.
I don't think any of us would feel quite as comfortable with the particular eye of this poem as he was then, picking up the obligation of a poet to dramatize how he's able to write or not able to write. There's one poem from this period about San Francisco. He was sent with an eminent textile artist to Santa Fe and to LA and to San Francisco to try to encourage a market for Polish textiles, the new socialist government. So not knowing that he was going to spend 30 years here, he's writing a little poem untitled, "The sad little birds of the eternal spring in steep, cold San Francisco. Joy here has a doleful taste, although it dresses in Parisian style. The seals lie barking on rocks washed by the ocean waves, blues, whites of the hills above the bay. Wanda, this is the woman he's working with, wants to talk about economic planning. And well, the people here are like people everywhere, energetic and silly. One speaks these banalities, and actually the heart bleeds. And remember the terrible fish at Fisherman's Wharf? One looked like a Javanese dancer. And also recalled the Habim, something probably improbable. Another we called Odetta for the heroine in Proust, a patterned suit cut in the waist and the pink lips of the haut bourgeois. Crude, I know. I called it Odinitska. Recall then the bitter scent of rubbed eucalyptus. Take that back to Poland with you. Tell them what sort of stuff we ate here. It's his San Francisco poem. It's hard to know how to. The poem that he wrote that is considered a tour de force by Polish readers is a poem modeled on a poem by W.H. Auden written in these years called A New Year's Poem. It's a poem in rhymed couplets. Milosz wrote a poem in rhymed couplets about his situation. It's about 20 pages long, and you can't translate a poem in rhyme and have it say more or less exactly what the Polish says. You just, maybe Richard Wilbur could do it. I don't know who could do it. There's a Polish poet, Czeslaw Milosz, whose people say that his translation of Emily Dickinson are the best thing in contemporary Polish literature. There are poets who can somehow do that work. Anyway, he published this poem. It's called Treatise on Morals, or Treatise on Morality, depending on how you want to translate it. And David Frick said, let's just do, so people, we can't make the poem, it has the rhythm of a Krakow cabaret song. It rhymes learned words with slang. It's all over the place. It so baffled the censors that they let him publish it. And it's a poem about how to get on when you are being governed by the pistol. And I'll read you just a little of it for this part, and then I'll read one other poem from the other side, and then we can talk a bit. 36. The subject of this poem is what kind of morality survived the war. And from this vantage point, it seems kind of, so it has three main subjects. The first part is an advice not to believe anything anybody says. And then he looks at the three options, which are German phenomenology, French existentialism, and vodka. And it begins, his book of poems from the war years was called Rescue, Osolanie. Could also mean salvation, could also mean. Just what, O poet, do you propose to save? Can anything save this earth? This so-called dawn of peace, what has it given us? A few morning glories among the ashes. It's given hope's bile, the heart cunning, and I doubt it's aroused much pity. It's the opening stanza of this poem, cleverly rhymed. So this is my subject for today, and it takes on the tone of a lecture. From you, it will require the discipline of paring things down. And you have to resist filling the blanks with theory, however meekly and politely you do it. The sparest collection of sentences is changed when you change the place from which you look at them. You don't need to browse the Icelandic sagas, believing every word they say. And he goes on into a long, there's more of that. You doubt the veracity of Hindu myths. Though they give you pleasure, the knowledge of Atlantis is foreign but entertaining, and the totems of primitive people are not going to alter your customs as much as you would like them to. Anyway, let's grant them their due every day as necessary in tribute. Look this way at today's fables, a bit askance, but look at them seriously. So this goes on to argue, to talk about why. It's interesting in relation to his work of the war years, because he and Andrzejewski, the novelists, they were in their 30s, the young poets were in their 20s, these underground in the middle of the night meetings. He writes about their being very careful not to write heroic poems of Polish valor to get the young guys killed. After one of the readings, there was a young Polish poet went and laid a wreath on the statue of Copernicus in the middle of a square in Warsaw, because Copernicus was claimed by the Poles and the Germans. So this guy went and put a wreath in front of Copernicus thing, and was shot in the head. So that's what they, when he writes about not arousing too much pity for this land. So here's my advice. If you know what happened to the Greeks, you're way ahead of Herodotus. But you are acquainted with the edge of night. So settle down with Thucydides and distill the purple juice until you've touched with your finger the kernel of a style, then see what the footprint is in the legend. This is the kind of thing, working with David, I would say, wait, this is a scramble of mixed metaphors. There's a kernel touching a kernel with the style, and there's a footprint inside the kernel, and inside there's a legend. And he said, it just sounds great in Polish. So enough about books. Let's talk about existentialism. It's people who are important. It takes quite an imagination to judge them accurately today. Walking in prudence as if in a helmet, I must seriously warn you, it is easier than you think to lose your soul through unsuitable company. If you start getting used to their lies, for you are a sponge, you absorb everything. The principle must be strict. Let nothing escape examination. I want to add a sentence here. Don't let the president decide who gets to report in the... Let nothing escape examination. Your vision must be like an X-ray. It's not going to be a pretty picture. Better you seem cold and dry than that the tropical moss of unwashed souls, the stalactites of our terrible night, should grow over you. Judge people by this method. I tell you, it's strict and aristocratic. And beware madmen. They were nice enough as long as they were confined to institutions or kept in an ordinary stable. Today, there are competent madmen. And each, my child, waves his wand from on high. Truly, a madman on the loose is the greatest disaster in nature. This is no time for sneering, for the age has bred a peculiar type of schizophrenia. So on, let me just do the little bit on alcohol. You have probably already noticed I stress your way of life, since this is where you spend your time. So let's speak of alcohol. Poland bows down in difficult times with little jokes and anecdotes before the idols of vodka and kielbasa, nostalgic for the mead of the old nobility, and before tears and after tears, it reels in Slavonic fashion, and toting up its poverty and hiccups, finds a multitude of reasons for boasting. The phenomenon of vodka is interesting. It would be worth a dissertation. Of all drinks, vodka alone is akin to the fumes of extermination. Again, of all drinks, vodka alone is akin to the fumes of extermination. In it, you can see the shimmer of burning cities. Through its thin glass, the convicts go. And when the houses hiss at night, and the fire is a pupil in the eye of the windows, the brothers Karamazov, with glim faces, have sat down to a leader, and the smell of formic acid rises from an antheap and grows stronger in the summer heat. So on. You get some feel for what's going on. And doing it with David, we read the Polish aloud and laugh and chuckle, and I'm sitting there wondering what's going on. Let me just skip to the end. There's a poem called Three Choruses for an Unwritten Poem called Hiroshima. It interests me about how you write about that. And those. One is just a very vivid description of the Enola Gay landing after it's dropped the bomb. There's a poem called Sigrid and Erica, addressing a handsome young German couple after the war. So he's been through all this stuff and he's back with his wife. And a poem from a notebook called Bonds by Lake Leman. Red beaches, shining poplars, in steep spruce behind October fog. In the valley, the lake steams. There's snow already on the hillsides on the other shore. Of life, what remains? Only this light, so that the eyes blink in the sunny noon. People say, this is, and no capacity, no artfulness can reach beyond what is, and memory, useless, loses its power. The kegs smell of cider. The vicar mixes lime with the spade in his little garden in front of the school. My son had just been reunited with his family after 2 years. My son runs there on the path. Boys carry sacks of chestnuts gathered on the slope. If I forget thee, Jerusalem, says the prophet, let my right hand wither. Underground tremors shake what is. Mountains crack and forests break, touched by what was, what will be. All that is crumbles into dust, violent, clean. The world is again in ferment, and neither ambition nor memory ceases. Autumnal skies, same as in childhood, in adulthood, in old age. I won't stare at you, and you, landscapes, nourishing our hearts with mild warmth. What poisons dwell in you that you seal our lips, make us sit with folded arms and the look of sleepy animals. Whoever finds order, peace, and an eternal moment in what is will vanish like everything else without a trace. Do you agree then to abolish what is and pluck from movement the eternal moment as a gleam on the current of the Black River? I do. And that's the phrase that ends this book in both this version and the Polish version. So that's some of the story of of exploring. There are about 35 or 40 poems that hadn't been translated before, and the adventure was diving into them. Question and answer. How are we doing on time?
We might have something from online. Let me take a peek. Not yet. Anyone in here? Usually takes a sec. Ah, here we are.
One of the things that always struck me, I had read Milosz in translation quite a bit before I ever heard him. Perhaps it was a reading we gave together in Santa Fe, I'm not sure, him reading in Polish. And I was stunned by the music that you can't bring across. So you've been talking about, I had the same thing in working with Russian translations of a lot of metered and some unmetered work. Unmetered was easier, as you said, but you would try to create some parallel poetic universe, and it's impossible, literally, and yet at the same time it does offer us this opening for which I'm very grateful to have to the work. But then there is this other music, sometimes almost symphonic and sometimes quietly lyrical and so on, that really opens your eyes to formal verse, among other things, and its possibilities.
Yeah. No, it was. I mean, it was comic at some points. You know, I would try to do some musical effect. An example that I've given often is there's a poem written during the war years. One of his great poems. He was hoping the English and Americans would win the war, and so he was teaching himself English by reading the Songs of Innocence of William Blake. and he read, there's a poem called The World, and it's a series of short poems, rhymed poems, in the meter of a child's primer. And there's a poem about the kids coming home from school and what's in their pencil box. Crumbs, a penny, and then they're walking by where their dad is hoeing in the garden, and then they go into and so on. And there's a poem in there called Parable of the Poppy Seed, in which the mother is telling the children a goodnight story, and it goes roughly, on a seed of poppy, there's a house, and inside it are people and a cat. And outside in the yard, not knowing, there's a dog sleeping and then barking. And it rhymes. So I tried, I'm embarrassed, anyway, on a seed of poppy is a tiny house. Inside it are people, a cat and a mouse. Outside in the yard, a dog barks at the moon, and then in his one world sleeps until noon. The earth is a poppy seed and nothing more, and that seed's a garden, and that seed's a planet, and that seed's a star. And even if there were 100,000, each would contain a house and a garden, all in a poppy head. They grow taller than hay. The children run through and the poppy plants sway. And in the night, when the moon is aloft, you hear dogs barking, first loud, then soft. And I thought, and I showed it to Czeslaw, and he said, mouse? There is no mouse in my poem. Does one need to be told that poppy is taller than hay? So that was the problem. Over the years, I acquired many Polish friends, so I could say of a poem. So what's the feel of this? Just this thing of trying to, and my friend Renata said, like a bell being struck, a clear bell being struck, which is the thing that people said about the early poems. And I said to Adam Zagajewski, is there this early metrical work, what is it like? He said, probably Yeats. He's just a magician. And he was interested in philosophical problems and all, but he could do magic. So anyway, it was trying to get away with the music. And if it didn't say more or less exactly in English what the Polish said, he couldn't stand it.
So we have a question from online. Actually, a couple. Let's see if I can scroll down. Do I recall Milosz was critical of translations of his work by another UC faculty colleague, Leonard Nathan? How was Milosz's work as a translator?
How
It's how was Milosz to work with as a translator?
yeah. So he was when he arrived in Berkeley in about 1960. One of the things he set about doing was translating Polish poetry into English to give his world to this new world he had to live in. And he was at this time also tormented with that he wanted some version of the Christian story. He only says this later when he's 80 years old in a poem called Treatise on Theology. He wanted there to be a God or something like a God so that there could be justice. He found it unbearable that it wasn't that he wanted the evil punished, but he wanted a judgment that this is right and this is wrong, because he was and he couldn't find his way there, and partly for the reason that it troubles any monotheist, which is, how could a good God have permitted all of this stuff to happen? And so he got very interested in Gnosticism, in the Christian sense of that there was a demiurge that created the material world and a spiritual being that created the world of good, and that they were in conflict. It's interesting to think of him. I had not met him yet when he was first doing this, but my friend Linda Gregg audited a couple of his classes, and she describes Czeslaw trying to tell all the Berkeley kids in their tie-dye shirts in the 1960s, singing "All You Need Is Love," and explain to them that the material world was created by an evil demiurge. So he was struggling with these things and translating Polish poetry into English in free verse, because you have to. So he was teaching himself the free verse that he then used for 30 years of amazing poetry of exile and memory, as he struggled with all these things, with his ear full of T.H. Lawrence, whom he read and translated, with Whitman, whom he read and translated, and worked with various, with Leonard Nathan among others, Lillian Valley, and when I worked with him and with my friend Robert Pinsky, who was pretty good at finding formal ways to get the rhyme in. I remember him showing Czeslaw one of the poems from that Songs of Innocence sequence, and Czeslaw said, "Where is the rhyme?" And Robert said, "It's slant rhyme, off rhyme." And he said, "Oh, I see, modern rhyme." Modern rhyme, wasn't going to have it. Let me get one of the poems of his torment about this. I think I can find it well. Well, maybe I can't find it quickly. Meaning 569. When I die, I'm going to see the lining of the world, the other side, beyond bird, mountain, sunset, the true meaning, ready to be decoded. What never added up will add up. What was incomprehensible will be comprehended. And if there is no lining to this world, if a thrush on a branch is not a sign, but just a thrush on a branch, if night and day make no sense following each other, doing it just because they do it, and on this earth there is nothing except this earth, even if that is so, there will remain a word wakened by lips that have perished, a tireless messenger who runs and runs through interstellar fields, through revolving galaxies, and calls out, protests, screams. This is he's 80 years old saying this. And I would say to him, my job was to, but sometimes he would say, "You're not telling me what you think of this poem." And I would say, "What's wrong with a thrush on a branch? That seems pretty miraculous to me." And he would say, "I didn't say there was something beyond this. I said the protest will go on into infinity." So that was sort of the unstable place of his torment in these later years. Anyway,
I think we have some more questions from online. Let me see if I can find this. How is his poem Campo del Fiore received in Poland? I've wondered if it's imply. Oh God, I'm so sorry. This is cutting off. Okay, implicit. I'm wondering if it's implicit negative portrayal of Poles during the war sours opinion towards him.
could you do that again?
Yeah, sure. So, how is his poem Campo del Fiore received in Poland? I've wondered if its implicit negative portrayal of Poles during the war sours opinions towards him.
Yeah, I don't know. There is a poem called Campo de Fiore that's one of his best-known poems that is one of the ones that addresses the Holocaust most directly. And it was, it was published in the volume Rescue during the period when he was allowed to publish, but then all of his poems were taken down. And then later, when when the regime fell around the Solidarity time, all of his poems came back into print, and that one felt like an important poem about resistance to dictatorship. So today, it's been a few years since I've been in Poland, but my impression at the moment is because of Szymborska's Nobel Prize, and because there's another very great poet named Zbigniew Herbert, and a couple of others, that the younger generation is trying to ease out from under these marble busts of great poetry and do something else, something different. And the two poets that I think have been most influential in that way, one of them is Frank O'Hara, because I said, "Why Frank O'Hara?" And a Polish friend said, "Shopping." You know, for 30 years they really couldn't shop. You know, there was no market because there was a planned economy. You know, here's the fabric store. Here's the thing, and so Frank O'Hara felt like heaven to the young poets, and he was not so morally serious. He was what Czeslaw was complaining about. You know. Touching the sacred wound, they don't have to do that. The other poet who's been important to them is Michael Palmer. The idea in American poetry of experiment with language. Roots of Polish poetry are French, and there's been some return to the interest in French poetry and to American poets who are not tied to realist conventions. What?
Anyone else in the room here might have a question? No?
So,
Oh, we might find ourselves. Oh, okay. I guess we have one more. We'll take one more. If I can manage to find this. How much do you find our present moment to echo the world described by Milosz in The Captive Mind? And if so, how have your translations or the readings you're doing today been informed by that experience?
by the experience of the captive mind.
Yeah, The Captive Mind.
So The Captive Mind was the book that he wrote in 1952. Once he had sought political asylum and was put up in this little house where the painter I had described to you, the great Joseph Chopsky, and a couple of others were starting an emigre press. Czeslaw, at that point, thought of himself as a socialist, but was trying to figure out, there wasn't an idea then of being an anti-Stalinist socialist in the way that at the moment there doesn't seem to be much of an idea of being pro-Israeli anti-Zionist. There's complicated stuff to navigate at that point. Anyway, he went there. The biography describes him as thinking he had made a mistake. The most powerful young poet in Paris at the time was another diplomat, Pablo Neruda, the Chilean embassy, and the French Communist Party fingered Neruda to write the denunciation of Milosz for giving up on communism. And Czeslaw wrote The Captive Mind as a response to Pablo Neruda's attack on him. Another story off the... My friend Renata said that in 1980s in New York at a Penn conference, Neruda and Milosz, who had as young men translated each other's poems, met again. And Neruda walked over to Milosz and said, "Czeslaw," and went to embrace him, and Czeslaw turned away, and Milosz said, "Czeslaw, that was just politics." It's not, anyway, whether that's, I pass that on, that story. So anyway, so the Captive Mind, which is still an incredibly readable book, he wrote during that time, and then he turned back to poetry. I don't know if this answered the question about it, but I think that the Captive Mind is struggling with the stuff that the poems in this book is struggling with. And then after he'd done that, he turns to write about the war, to write about what was wrong with the poetry written in the years before the war that people didn't see what was coming, and that what this long poem is about is partly on the one hand, mental reservation, that is, having your own private thoughts. If more and more people start buying Donald Trump, and more and more you're thinking, well, I'm not going to get into it. If more and more people are thinking, I don't want to talk about Gaza, oh well, okay, maybe it's okay that Trump is making a deal on Ukraine. There are a whole bunch of ways in which you begin to think about, you give up on this, you give up on this, you hold your tongue in certain situations because what's the point? You're not going to convince anybody. And maybe change is going to come. In this poem, he's saying maybe in future, somebody like when they brought Christianity to the northern lands from Constantinople, maybe the next person is going to come from Etruria or something and create a new. So there was that. He was feeling that far from a place where you could imagine justice, kindness, life, and are you supposed to moan? Are you supposed to be Antigone? There's the best poem in here is a translation of Antigone to her sister, explaining, "I'm not going to give up. I'm not going to." So there was that, and the fascination of this book, I think, is watching him struggle with this. Yeah. But I think that's enough. Huh? Thank you all very much.